The plane began its climb into the sky, the hum of the engines blending with the soft murmur of voices around the cabin. It was an ordinary flight for most, but in row 23, a quiet story was about to unfold. The young man sat alone by the window, his cane resting beside him. His fingers typed steadily on his phone, his eyes rarely leaving the glass, as the city beneath shrank into the distance. There was something about him that felt different, yet no one seemed to notice. He was just another face in the crowd, just another passenger on a long flight across the country. But if anyone had looked a little closer, they might have seen the way his lips moved silently, as if speaking to himself, or noticed how his hands would occasionally gesture in the air, in slow, precise movements, his manner calm, but his eyes always searching the faces around him. The flight attendants began their rounds. Claire, one of the attendants, was a young woman in her 30s, tired from the long shifts that seemed to stretch endlessly. She moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this job hundreds of times before. Today was no different. She was ready to offer drinks with the same smile. She gave every passenger a polite but automatic smile. But as she made her way down the aisle, her eyes caught sight of the man in row 23, sitting still as the rest of the cabin came alive around him. He didn't seem to be paying attention to anything, just staring out the window. Or maybe it was the way he was dressed, simple and quiet, with the cane that caught her eye. But Claire didn't stop to think about it much. She had more important things to do. As she reached him, she smiled and leaned forward to ask him what he would like to drink. She was about to speak when she saw him raise a hand and tap his ear lightly, a small but deliberate gesture. Claire's smile faltered for just a moment. Her training told her what this meant. He was deaf. But she didn't have time for this, not today. She quickly reached into the cart and grabbed a drink, offering it to him with a polite but impersonal nod. He reached for his phone and typed something. Claire didn't look at it. She had already turned away as she moved on to the next seat. The man's request for a blanket was left unanswered as she continued down the aisle without sparing him another glance. The man watched her go. His fingers tightened slightly around the phone as he typed a second message. His face remained calm, but there was a flicker of frustration hidden in his eyes. He had been through this countless times before. The dismissive glances, the avoidance, the discomfort of people who didn't know how to react. But he was used to it. He had learned to accept it long ago. Still, it never stopped the small pang of disappointment. When it happened, he glanced at his phone once more. The message was simple: "Can I get a blanket?" And as he held it up, a subtle ripple of hope passed through him. Maybe this time it would be different. Maybe this time someone would take the time to understand. But the flight attendant had already moved on without a word, and the silence that followed seemed to stretch endlessly between them. Claire didn't think much of it as she moved down the aisle. Her mind was already on the next task, and the one after that. The rhythm of the job was familiar to her, and she had learned to do it without much thought. But something about the man in row 23 lingered in her mind, like a small irritant. Something she couldn't shake. His eyes had caught hers for just a moment when she handed him the drink, but there had been no gratitude in his gaze, no words, just a silence that seemed to hang in the air. Claire shrugged it off. It was probably just his way of being difficult. She had seen people like him before, the ones who wanted special treatment, the ones who expected more than they were entitled to. But Claire didn't have the time or energy for it today. There was too much to do, and too many passengers to attend to, so she moved on. As she continued with her duties, she glanced over at row 23 again. The man was still there, his face partially illuminated by the soft light above him, his fingers tapping away at his phone, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just ignored his request. It irritated her slightly. His calmness almost made her feel foolish, like she had done something wrong. But she quickly pushed the thought aside. After all, it wasn't her problem, it was his. Claire made her way back down the aisle to check on the other passengers, but her eyes were drawn to him again. There he was, still sitting silently, staring out the window this time. His fingers weren't typing, but instead were moving in slow, deliberate motions, as though he was signing something to himself. The subtle gestures of his hands reminded her of something, but she couldn't quite place it. Maybe he was talking to someone, she thought. But then she remembered. He was alone, there was no one next to him, just an empty seat. Claire stopped in her tracks. For a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, but only for a second, before she continued on her way. Her mind was already back on the work at hand. As the flight continued, Claire's patience began to wear thin. She had already dealt with a few difficult passengers and a handful of complaints, but the man in row 23 kept coming back to her thoughts. She found herself watching him more and more. He was different from the others, in a way that unsettled her. His calmness, his quiet strength, it made her feel uncomfortable, almost as if he was observing her rather than the other way around. And every time she glanced his way, he seemed to be watching her too. But it was the kind of watching that felt like he was waiting for something, waiting for her to make a mistake or do something wrong. Finally, she couldn't ignore it any longer. She was passing by row 23 again, this time with a tray full of snacks for the passengers. As she approached, she braced herself for the same awkward silence. But as she neared him, she noticed something strange. His phone was facing up, and the screen was filled with a typed message this time. It was more direct, more urgent. The message simply said, "I need a blanket, please. Can you help me this time?" Claire hesitated, her fingers tightening around the tray for a moment, before she walked over to him with an almost mechanical smile, ready to dismiss him again, just like before. But as she caught his eyes this time, there was something different, something in his gaze that made her pause for just a fraction of a second. Was it frustration or something else? It was too quick to tell, but it was there. The plane hummed along its path as Claire moved down the aisle, once more her eyes flicking over the passengers. Without truly seeing them, she was exhausted, and her mind was far from focused. Each step was automatic, each action driven by habit. The quiet murmurs of the other passengers seemed to blur together in her mind. When she reached the end of the aisle, she paused briefly to check her watch. Just a few more minutes until she could take a break. But before she could take another step, she glanced over at row 23 again. The young man was still there, sitting as he had been for the entire flight, fingers dancing across his phone. This time, his gaze wasn't directed out the window, but toward the flight attendant, as if he was waiting for her to come back. She swallowed a sigh as she turned to face him, walking toward his seat with the same polite smile she had offered before. But this time, something inside her was different. A small irritation, beginning to creep in her mind, kept asking, why was he acting this way? Why didn't he just ask for help, like anyone else? Why did he have to make everything so difficult? As she neared him, she noticed the phone still in his hand, his fingers quickly typing something. Once again, the same message, "I need a blanket, please." Claire didn't even look at it. She was already moving past him. When he lifted the phone higher, holding it directly in her line of sight, her eyes flickered down for a moment, the small words flashing across the screen, "Can you please help me just once?" This time she paused for a heartbeat longer than usual. But the thought of stopping and engaging him was something she didn't want to entertain, not right now. Instead, she reached out for the tray she had been carrying and gave him a quick, curt nod, without saying anything, just as she had done before, without any acknowledgement of the effort he had made to communicate. Her eyes darted away, and she kept moving on. But as she passed by, she heard a soft murmur from the woman sitting a few rows ahead, an elderly passenger who had been watching the exchange in silence, her voice barely above a whisper, but sharp enough to carry. "How rude of her," the woman muttered, just loud enough for Claire to hear, but not directly at her. The words stung more than they should have. Claire's face flushed, but she didn't stop to apologize, didn't even glance at the woman. Instead, she turned a corner to continue with her duties, but the words lingered in the air, following her like a shadow. It was then that Claire caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. The man in row 23 was still watching her, but this time his gaze wasn't filled with the same patience or expectation. It was cold, a quiet disapproval in his eyes that stopped her in her tracks. For just a second, it wasn't the kind of look that could be dismissed easily. It was the kind of look that made her question herself, made her wonder if she had done something wrong. But before she could process it, she heard another voice from a few rows behind. "Excuse me, miss, can I get a glass of water?" The request snapped her back into focus, and she moved on quickly to fulfill the new demand. As she moved away, the unease in her chest didn't disappear. In fact, it only grew the rest of the flight, seemed to drag on with each passing minute, her earlier disinterest beginning to morph into something more like guilt. But she pushed it aside. After all, there was too much to do to let it distract her. She had a job to finish. But every time she glanced toward row 23, she felt that unsettling sense of being watched. The minutes ticked by slowly. The plane's steady hum felt almost like a lullaby to some, but not to Claire. She could feel the weight of the hours on her shoulders as she moved back down the aisle, her feet dragging slightly with each step. Her mind was already beginning to wander as she made her way past the rows of seated passengers, her eyes automatically scanning for any signs of trouble. But it was row 23 that caught her attention again. There he was, the young man, still sitting alone, his hands resting on his lap. This time he wasn't typing on his phone, but instead holding it in his hand, a message displayed on the screen. He didn't make any attempt to catch her eye this time. His gaze was focused ahead, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if he were bracing himself for something. But Claire didn't stop. She kept walking past him, like she had done so many times before. She was almost halfway down the aisle when she heard the soft click of a phone being raised into the air just in front of her. For a moment, she thought it was another passenger asking for help. But when she turned her gaze to the phone screen, it was the young man's message again. The words were simple but direct. "I need some water, please. Can you help me?" It was nothing unusual. It was a request like any other, but something about it made Claire's chest tighten. There was no pleading in the message, no sense of urgency, just a calm directness that made her pause for a brief moment. Too long. It wasn't the words that unsettled her, but the way they were presented. It was as if he had resigned himself to the fact that asking for help was a futile exercise, and yet he was still asking. She couldn't bring herself to stop, not this time, not with so many other passengers to attend to, so she glanced at the phone for a moment, and then, without acknowledging it or him, she moved on again, her eyes quickly darting away. The silence that followed was louder than any words could have been. She could feel his presence there behind her as she continued down the aisle, the weight of his gaze following her every step. The feeling of being watched was becoming impossible to ignore. She tried to focus on the other passengers, trying to tune out the growing discomfort that filled the pit of her stomach. But it was hard to concentrate when she knew he was still watching her from behind. Just as she reached the front of the plane, she heard a voice call out from a few rows back, "Excuse me, miss. Could you please bring me a pillow?" The request was simple enough, but it was enough to snap her back into focus for a moment. It gave her the chance to breathe a little easier, to remind herself that there were other people to attend to. She wasn't going to let the young man in row 23 get to her. She couldn't. Yet, as she made her way back down the aisle to fulfill the new request, she caught sight of the woman in row 22, the elderly woman who had been watching the entire interaction. She hadn't said anything more, but Claire could see the way she looked at her, eyes narrowed with a kind of quiet judgment that made her heart race. For a moment, the thought of returning to row 23 crossed her mind, but she quickly pushed it aside. After all, she had already done her part. The man had been difficult from the start, and there was no reason to indulge him any further. But deep down, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something inside her was telling her she had made a mistake. Claire's thoughts raced as she moved down the aisle again, her hands trembling slightly as she grabbed another drink for a passenger who had called out to her. But it wasn't the request that made her uneasy. It was the thought of the man in row 23 that kept creeping into her mind. She had tried to focus on the other passengers, to put him out of her thoughts, but each time she glanced over toward him, it felt like an invisible force was pulling her eyes back to his seat. His quiet, calm demeanor now seemed like something much more unsettling. The weight of his gaze was enough to make her stomach twist a little more with each step she took. She couldn't help it. The longer she tried to avoid him, the more she felt this strange unease building inside her. There was something about the way he carried himself that made her question herself, made her feel like she was missing something, like she had underestimated him from the beginning. But she refused to acknowledge it. After all, it wasn't her fault. He was being difficult. It wasn't her fault. He wasn't following the same rules as everyone else. Why should she have to treat him differently just because he couldn't hear? But then there was the look in his eyes, the one that had stopped her in her tracks the first time she had truly looked at him. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was something far more disarming, a quiet sadness, a kind of weary resignation that struck her deeper than she cared to admit. The plane began its descent, the gentle shift in altitude only adding to the tension in the cabin. As Claire continued down the aisle, she tried to focus on the task at hand. But there was something in the air, now something thick and heavy with expectation. She didn't know why, but she felt like she was being pulled toward row 23, like the man was waiting for her to finally stop and listen to him. She was almost at the end of the aisle when she saw it again, the phone raised in the air, a message clearly displayed on the screen. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized that this time it wasn't just a simple request. It wasn't just another ask for a drink or a blanket. The message was different this time. It said something that made Claire's blood run cold. "I'm not the one you should be ignoring." For a moment, everything around her seemed to blur. Her breath caught in her throat. She had no idea who this man was, but the words on the screen made it clear that he knew something she didn't. And in that instant, it was as if the world had shifted just a little out of place. She turned to face him, her mouth going dry, as she saw the phone now lowered slightly, but his eyes were locked onto hers with a quiet intensity that left her breathless. The flight attendant beside her didn't seem to notice her hesitation as she continued serving the other passengers, oblivious to the sudden shift in the atmosphere around them. But Claire couldn't ignore it anymore. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that this wasn't just another passenger. She was dismissing that the calmness he exuded was hiding something much deeper, something more complex than she had ever imagined. She glanced down at the phone again, and then back up at him. His face had softened, but the message was clear. His presence in that seat was not by chance, and he was not just any passenger waiting for her to give him a blanket or water. He was waiting for her to truly see him, and for the first time she wasn't sure she wanted to. Claire stood frozen in the aisle, her heart pounding in her chest, as her eyes locked with the man in row 23. For a brief moment, everything else around her seemed to fade into the background. The sound of the engines, the murmur of the other passengers, all became distant as she stared into his gaze. It was almost as if he was holding her there with his eyes, making her feel like there was something she was missing, something right in front of her, but she couldn't quite place it. His phone lowered slowly, as if he had sensed her unease. His fingers rested lightly on the screen, his expression unreadable, but there was something behind his calm facade that made Claire's throat tighten. It wasn't just the message, it was the way he had looked at her before, the quiet intensity in his eyes that made her feel small, like he knew something she didn't. And that thought was enough to make her stomach churn. She blinked and shook her head slightly, trying to break the spell. But as she turned to continue down the aisle, her steps faltered for a brief moment. As she passed by row 23, she couldn't help but glance back at him again. His presence seemed to linger like a shadow in the corner of her vision, and she could feel his eyes on her still, even though she had tried to turn away. As she moved toward the front of the plane, she found herself growing more and more unsettled. The normal rhythm of the flight had been disrupted. Her mind was racing with questions that she couldn't answer. Who was he? What was it that made him different from the other passengers? Why did she feel this sense of unease whenever she thought about him? The flight attendant beside her noticed her hesitation and gave her a quick glance, but Clea couldn't bring herself to explain she didn't even fully understand herself. What was happening, all she knew, was that there was something about the man in row 23 that made her question everything she had taken for granted. Until now, her job, her routine, her indifference to the passengers she served every day. As Clea reached the front of the plane, she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The thought of returning to row 23 seemed impossible now. Too much time had passed. Too much tension had built up between them. It felt like the moment for simple politeness was long gone, but still she couldn't shake the feeling that she had to go back, that something in her had to acknowledge him, that she couldn't just walk away anymore. The elderly woman who had been watching her from the side glanced up at her again. This time their eyes met, and for the briefest moment, Clea saw the judgment in the woman's gaze, the unspoken criticism that seemed to hang between them, and Clea felt a cold wave of guilt wash over her. It was as if the weight of every ignored request, every misjudged glance, had finally caught up with her all at once. Her heart raced as she turned back toward the aisle and began walking down again, her footsteps purposeful but slow each step, bringing her closer to row 23. She could feel her breath catch in her chest. With every movement, her mind racing faster than her body could keep up. But she couldn't ignore the feeling that something had changed, something had shifted in the air around her, like the calm before a storm. As she neared the row, she could see him once more, his face still calm, but his eyes were locked onto hers, waiting for her to approach, waiting for her to make a choice she wasn't ready to make. But as Clea drew closer to him, something inside her shifted just a little bit more. It was as if her own doubt and guilt were being reflected in his gaze, and for the first time she realized that she wasn't the only one who had been waiting. The closer Clea got to row 23, the heavier her steps felt, each movement weighed down by an invisible force. She could feel her breath coming quicker now, her chest tightening with each breath, as though the air on the plane had thickened. Somehow the man's eyes never left hers. As she drew nearer, his calm demeanor now felt almost predatory in its stillness, like he was waiting for something to break, like he was watching her fall apart piece by piece. But still Clea couldn't stop herself. Her feet kept moving as if they were being guided by something outside her control. She reached row 23 and stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say or do. She had never been in a situation like this before, and the silence between them seemed to stretch on forever. Finally she spoke, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "Can I help you with something?" It was the same question she had asked hundreds of times before, but this time it felt different. The words felt empty in the air, as though they carried no meaning at all. The man in row 23 didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly lowered his gaze to the phone in his hand and typed something once again. Clea watched as the screen lit up with another message. This time the words were simple, but they carried weight that hit her like a punch to the gut. "I know who you are." The air around her seemed to freeze for a moment. Her heart skipped a beat as she stared at the words on the screen. It wasn't just the message that made her feel uneasy. It was the fact that the man in row 23 had just said something she didn't understand, something that hit too close to home. Her throat went dry, and for a split second she felt as though she might collapse under the weight of it. All she wanted to step back, to turn away, to pretend none of this was happening. But she couldn't move. Her feet were rooted to the floor, her hands trembling as she stood there staring at him. The man looked up then. His expression was still calm, but there was something in his eyes that made Clea's blood run cold. It wasn't anger or hatred. It was something much more unsettling, something that made her feel like he was seeing straight through her, as though he knew everything about her. And in that moment she realized something terrifying. He probably did. She had never seen him before in her life, but somehow he seemed to know everything about her, her name, her job, her life, everything she had worked so hard to keep hidden. now seemed to be laid bare in the space between them. It was as though he had peeled away the layers of her carefully constructed reality and exposed her for who she really was. The man's lips parted slightly as if to speak, but before he could say anything, the flight attendant from the front of the plane approached Claire's side, breaking the tension with a soft cough. "Is everything all right here?" The question was innocent enough, but it felt like a lifeline to Claire, a way to escape the suffocating grip of the moment. But even as she turned to answer the other attendant, her mind was still spinning, her heart racing, as the man in row 23's gaze lingered on her, his eyes still watching her every move, his presence lingering in the air like a shadow that wouldn't leave. As Claire spoke to the flight attendant, her mind was screaming at her to do something, anything, to regain control of the situation. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the feeling that everything around her had shifted, something had changed. And she wasn't sure she could go back to the way things had been before the man in row 23 had come into her life. Claire stood there, her mind spinning, unable to make sense of the message, or the man standing before her. The world around her felt distorted, as though she were caught in a dream she couldn't wake up from. The flight attendant beside her had asked if everything was all right, but Claire couldn't even form a proper response. The weight of the man's words hung heavy in the air, like an ominous cloud. She wanted to step back, to retreat, to take control of the situation, but something kept her rooted to the spot. Her eyes locked onto his, and for the first time she realized how powerless she felt. The man's eyes softened ever so slightly, his gaze no longer as cold, but it wasn't comforting. Instead, it made her feel more exposed, like he was waiting for her to crack open some hidden part of herself that she didn't even know existed. His lips parted slowly, as if to say something, but before the words could come out, Claire found her voice breaking through her own silence. "What do you mean by that?" She whispered, her voice barely audible in the hum of the plane, but to her it felt as loud as a scream. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her phone once more, typing something quickly before looking up at her again. This time his expression was unreadable, but there was something familiar in the way he looked at her. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment his entire life, like everything had led up to this point. The silence stretched between them, but finally he spoke, his voice low and steady. "You don't remember, do you?" His words hit her like a slap to the face. Her heart skipped a beat, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. For a moment, Claire felt like the world had stopped turning, as if she had been thrown into another reality, a place where everything she knew didn't exist. "Remember what?" she asked, her voice cracking as her throat closed up. "What are you talking about?" His eyes never left hers as he spoke again, his tone unhurried, almost casual. "You were there when it happened, Claire. You were the one who helped cover it up." The words seemed to hang in the air like a heavy fog. Claire felt her chest tighten as the truth began to take shape in her mind, but it was a truth she wasn't ready to confront yet. Something about it made her want to turn and run, but the man's gaze kept her rooted to the spot. Her mind raced, trying to place his face, trying to recall a time when she could have known him. But the memories wouldn't come. It was as if the past had been wiped away by some unseen hand, and now this stranger was accusing her of something she couldn't even remember. The air in the cabin felt suffocating now, the hum of the plane no longer a comforting sound, but a constant reminder of the pressure building around her. She could feel the sweat forming on her palms, her breathing growing shallow as she fought to keep control of her emotions. She glanced at the flight attendant beside her, who seemed oblivious to the growing tension between them, but Claire couldn't look away from the man in row 23 anymore. It was as if the world had narrowed down to just the two of them. "You're lying," she managed to say, but even as she spoke the words felt hollow, her voice wavering in the air. She wanted to believe it was a lie. She wanted to believe he was just some crazy passenger who had it out for her. But deep down, Claire knew he wasn't lying. Something about his presence felt undeniable, like a ghost from her past had come back to claim her. The man leaned forward slightly as if he were about to reveal something more, but at that very moment, the plane hit a slight turbulence, shaking everyone in their seats and breaking the tension for just a fraction of a second. Claire felt the weight of it lift slightly, but the questions still swirled in her mind. What had he meant by his words? Who was he really? And what had happened between them that she couldn't remember? But before she could ask another question, the flight attendants were moving swiftly down the aisle, directing everyone to prepare for landing, and the moment was over just like that. But as Claire took her seat and fastened her belt, she couldn't shake the feeling that the man in row 23 wasn't finished with her, that whatever had been left unsaid still hung between them, waiting to come to light.